together and integrate being Christian and your native spirituality?
That's a complicated process, and it took me years. I was thinking this morning that it was probably not until I was in seminary that I began to make that kind of cultural dynamic conscious. Because, as is the case with every person, culture is automatic. We just think we're acting normal when we're following the rules of our own cultural system.
Like, what culture did you start with?
Well, I come out of a Lakota culture. We call ourselves Lakota. The American government calls us Sioux. My family has been westernized over the last 3 generations. My grandfather died in 1953 at the age of 99. He grew up and lived most of his life in the old prairie style of Lakota life, living in a teepee, on horseback, chasing buffalo. He was probably 50 years old before there were any white people in our part of the world. My parents went through all of the various efforts to westernize Native people. They went through the language suppression and residential school and all that kind of experience. And so then my generation comes along, the baby boomer generation after World War II. And so that's my base, really, actually, a Lakota life. But by the time I come along, our family has already developed patterns which bring together Lakota tradition and Christianity. In the last century, the American government assigned denominations to tribes in the U.S., and there was that one official mission. The Sioux Nation was assigned to the Episcopal Church, but we had Jesuits around even before they were Episcopalian missionaries. So 2 of our chiefs asked to have Catholic missions assigned, and they were assigned as well. Virtually all Sioux people belong to those 2, except for some refugees who came from Minnesota, there's some Presbyterian presence there and some congregational presence there. My family, being an Episcopalian family, and fairly typically that's the way it went, a whole extended family would join one denomination or the other, and an entire community in our area is typically Catholic or Episcopalian. All of my relatives are Episcopalian, and we had a pattern when I was a child. Even though the church believed that there should be a strong separation between Christianity and Lakota life, my family still had ways of bringing both of those dynamics together. Some was conscious and deliberate, such as participation in dancing, for example, social dancing, that in contemporary slang we call powwow dancing. My sister and brothers and I are all dancers, although our parents are not. Because in their era, if you belong to a church, you typically should not be a dancer. Well, by the time we came along, there was a revival of that whole dancing tradition. So we took part in that, realizing that we were going to get some criticism from church people, and we did. But still, we continued that practice. So some of that was conscious. Some was not conscious. As, for example, when my father's also an Episcopal priest. So when he is giving a sermon, quite often when he's speaking in Lakota, he talks about, he looks at the world and defines it along the lines of typical traditional Lakota thought, which is very different from Christian thought. Probably the most pressing maxim in Lakota life is to be a good relative, to observe all the rules of kinship, and those are very, very clearly defined, articulated, and taught in Lakota life. My father will sometimes speak about Christianity as a vehicle for observing the kinship code. And of course, I've never seen a seminary theologian talk about kinship codes when they talk about theology or ethics or something like that. But all of the world is perceived through this kinship. This conceptualization of the world as related. So aspects like that really are part of my father's thinking, but are not necessarily conscious. And they weren't for me either. So like I say, it really wasn't until I was into graduate school that I started to think about what it was that had bothered me about my education, why I didn't seem to fit the model of the typical student, those kinds of issues. When I was in 2nd grade, so that would be age 6, because I started first grade at age 5. Our teacher brought in a print from her home and asked us to guess what it was. We guessed every conceivable thing with feathers, and they were all wrong. And it turned out it was an illustration of an albino pheasant. Not too many second graders think about albino pheasants, I would guess. And then there was once she announced this, there was a flurry of activity in the classroom that I was not a part of. Students asking questions like, what was albinoism, what caused it, how likely was it? Various questions asking for information and analyzing the idea of an albino pheasant. I had no such reaction, and I thought there must be something wrong with me. And so for years, I assumed that I had some kind of mental incapacity, actually. But later realized that that wasn't the case. It's simply that I come from a system which is non-analytical. It's much more experiential, much more musing on thought and on concepts, but not really analyzing and looking at application and implications of concepts. So and Lakota thought is generally non-systematized anyway. And I think it's that quality that permits us to participate in thought systems and activities which may be in direct conflict one with the other. Two colleagues and I have published some material related to that. We were looking at what is unique in Lakota life in the first place, one colleague and I. Out of that, we developed what we think is a pretty clear explanation of Lakota thoughts toward how children should be raised. And those ideas we talk about, the absence of them is what we see being the problem for all youth who are at risk. And we define youth at risk as kids who are likely to fail in their family relationships or at school or their obligations to society, likely to fail in any quarter. We define those kids as youth at risk, although I think we've come to say that it's our feeling that any youth is at risk given family circumstances, economic conditions, all of those kinds of issues. We find typically that there are 4 life experiences that a person has to have a decent sense of oneself. The first is that you have to belong. Ideally, that's to family, to community, to society, to nation, to church, wherever it is. But we find an increasing number of young people all across the U.S. and Canada who don't have that experience. They don't belong to any social unit. They don't participate, don't feel like they belong to their city, to their province. They quite often don't even belong to their own households. There being a strong alienation between parents and children, for example. But that life experience of belonging is such a deep, integral part of every human being that kids will look for artificial places to belong, such as gangs, such as promiscuous behavior. All of those are examples of this desire to belong but not having it. And that need is consistent over a person's lifetime. The second life experience is that a person has to have a sense of accomplishment. Mastery, we call that. You have to know that you can do things in your life. And typically we have had families and towns and jobs provide those sorts of experiences for youth growing up. But we're finding that in the mass scale of society today, that sense of accomplishment isn't being experienced. The third life experience is the necessity to be responsible for oneself. We call that independence. One of the best vehicles for teaching independence is discipline. And of course, discipline is a big issue in schools because they're not really sure how to apply it. Part of the problem we see is that many people confuse punishment with discipline. Punishment is revenge. Discipline is always educational. And schools and even cities and police will lose sight of the necessity to educate people in self-responsibility and will instead think simply setting up a revenge system is going to be adequate somehow. The fourth life experience is an experience with one's own goodness. And the easiest way to achieve that is through a life of altruism. Simply being generous with one's time, one's abilities, one's goods. Provides that real sense of knowing that you are actually helping somebody. Provides a strong sense of self in young people. But it's not just young people who need those for it. It's people of all ages And people in every society and culture have to have all of those four experiences. If they don't, then their sense of self falters, and that's where you start to see all kinds of behavioral problems, criminal behavior, lack of decent social interaction. But those four have to be experienced. You can't tell people they have them. They have to feel it and realize it through their own lifetime.
How do any of us help that to happen?
Well, the first step is the most important one, and that is to make it a part of one's conscious planning. It has to become intentional. The problem with lots of youth programming that churches develop, for example, is that they think only of entertainment, rather than thinking of ways, how can we get our young people to belong to this community? How can we tap their own goodness so that they can see that there's a way of living that out? The point we have been stressing, my colleagues and I, is the point that these four principles that we call a circle of courage, this has to become a part of the thinking processes of anybody that deals with young people, or with any human population. We have been approached by businesses who have asked us to come and talk about this way of thinking because they see it as a reasonable way to relate to their employees or to relate to their customers. Native people who have been practicing Christians for much of their lives are thinking theologically about their roles as Native people. And one of the most pressing issues then is, what do we do with our own identity, our own culture, the original scheme of thinking that we have? What's the relationship of that to Christianity? And the idea that has really taken hold in Native communities is the idea that that's our Old Testament. Just as if you were to look at the Old Testament in the Christian Bible, you see a whole history of God's relationship to a particular people. A generation or two ago, I would say we assumed that the story of the Hebrew people had to be ours, and somehow we were supposed to fit in there. And that's impossible, and of course we found that awkward. To begin to think in that kind of a way. So what we have been thinking more lately is that God has related to our people all along. The Spirit of God has been in our community for generations. The ceremonies we have, the songs, the imagery that we have were all the best vehicles appropriate for ourselves as we related to God. What's important for us to do then is to deliberately force our thinking and our living so that we continue our relationship with Christianity, but at the same time enhance our own sense of self. That comes to an area that I call culture as therapy. In the 1970s, women psychologists everywhere were finding that the problems that women brought for therapy were not within the women themselves, but were the result of being female living in larger society. My guess is the same thing applies to Native people, because in First Nations communities, when we find people whose lives are in enormous disarray with chemical dependency or jail time or something like that, pretty typically those people have become divorced from their tradition. What has popped up several places in the U.S. Is an approach to those problems that's called the Red Road. The Red Road consists of kind of a cultural intensive program, a reculturalization, retribalization of a person whose life is in disarray. And for Native people, that process is enormously therapeutic. Native people seem not to need the same kinds of therapeutic approaches that another population might need, but the restoration of that cultural tradition within the life of that individual really stabilizes that person and makes their life profitable again. So I see that as a necessity for churches as well, and for churches to see First Nations cultures and to see the enhancement of those as in fact a major form of ministry, because that will bring about the wholeness and completeness, which is one of the promises that Jesus brings. I was thinking about this theme in Christian thought, that those who follow Jesus will follow the same path, that is a life of death and then assumedly of resurrection. And I was thinking that that theme is minimalized among many contemporary Christians who want to use it as the antidote for a bad day. And we'll just say, when things aren't going right and you have a flat tire or something, we'll just say, oh, well, here, this is my cross and I have to bear it. I think it's much more far-reaching than that. It is that the life experience of a Christian is going to have to be a life experience of dying. All the things that are dear that you might want to hold on to at some point in your life, and perhaps over your lifetime, you're simply going to have to lose if you're going to continue to follow the direction that God sets for you. For the church, I think this means that much of what we know as the church today is going to have to die. Here again, I think national denominational people are very nervous because they can only think of ways of trying to bolster up what they have known so far. And that's a mistake. When something is dying, it's best to let it die in peace and bury it. But as Christians, we look for what happens on the other side of it as really being the fulfillment of God's will. I think, for example, the church as we know it is not going to be effective with any young people. There are very, very few young people who are going to be willing to participate in the church as it has dealt with them. The church is going to have to take some radical new form, and that can only happen if the systems and the ideas and even the organizations and maybe even the personnel that are now in it, if those all die, then I think the church can take the form that it ought to in the future. It's not necessarily a comforting thought, but I think it is the only realistic thinking that the church can have about what the future holds for it. Lakota thought is such that time doesn't exist, particularly the concept of linear time. Time beginning here and traveling off to some endpoint. That doesn't exist for us. But what we do have is a whole philosophy of rhythms. And these rhythms are cyclic. So there is the rhythm of a season, going through all the seasons and coming back to winter again. We talk about a life having a cycle of birth and growth and maturation and aging and death. That's a life cycle, and there's a rhythm to that. There's the rhythm of the moon, of that cycle. So we have years and moons and lifespans and days, all of those rhythms over and over again. And so in that kind of circular thinking, we understand that all that we know now is going to go away. It may come back again in different form, but it may come back again. But our assumption is we're in some kind of a journey on. And so when we look at any event or experience, we typically think of it as passing. This is going to pass. It may come back again, but it's going to go away because of our life experience with these cycles. So Lakotas talk about there being another life, have always talked about there being another life. Not much speculation on what's there, but just the assumption it's there, so we don't need to get excited or nervous about leaving this one. We certainly don't have to get into kind of a Hollywood mode of trying to escape death, no matter what, which is really the stuff about practically every Hollywood movie. For us, it's a welcoming thing. We should welcome death and be willing to move into it. In fact, that's one of the commandments that was given to us when the pipe was brought to us by the buffalo calf woman. One of the commandments she gave to us is the commandment that we should move ahead in our own life cycle. So that means if you're a child, you should be anxious to grow up. When you're an adult, it means you should be glad to become old. When you're old, you should be willing to move into death, because all of those constitute our life cycle, and we should participate in that willingly. I had grown up in basically a Lakota world. I had grown up seeing white people, but really not knowing very many, until much later on in my life, when I decided that was going to be a part of my program. And I think that's pretty typically the case. What we see is that Indian people and white people in our area very seldom have personal contact with each other. They may have, because of professional obligations, may come together from time to time, but there is no real personal connection. And so it is as though we are invisible to one another, even though we live side by side. That's the most pressing problem. And it's the problem, I think, in any aspect of society where people from different cultures are together. That life experience, their ways of looking at the world are different enough. It feels so comfortable to be with one's own that it's much more likely that people will live in isolation from others rather than making real contact. So the people who have that ability and can actually accomplish real contact with others are extraordinary, I think. If you take people who come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different religious systems, for example, I think it's unlikely that they will spend a fair amount of personal time together. It's much more likely that they will gravitate toward people who are like themselves. Now, maybe there is some racism in that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be racism. I think it can simply be difference. Difference is very difficult to negotiate. I have the greatest fun when I'm working with a couple who are finding difficulties in their relationship, because they don't really get unglued over the big issues. It's not the big things, it's all those little issues that are at work. And the same thing is true in a society, like Canadian society, US society. It's the little ways in which we are different in our lives that are likely to keep us separate, not the big issues. The big issues we seem to handle. So I think I find it much more exciting. I'm the kind of person who finds it exciting to deal with people who are different from myself, to get to know them, to understand them. That life is to me much more complete than simply living in my own routine and doing all my own things. Culture has been my therapy. I had, I think, the best possible world, knowing that my parents believed I had to succeed in American life, that is, have an education, have a decent job, those kinds of things. They believed that very strongly, but they felt the loss, the threat of loss of their own cultural tradition, and so were very supportive when I was interested in participating more and more deeply in our own customary ways. So yeah, culture for me has been therapeutic. Finding the communities that I belong to, and there are several. And I think that's the case for every person. Every person has several communities that he or she participates in. And for me, knowing where my communities are knowing that I can go there when I need strength and nourishment and sustenance, makes my life complete.
Are there many people who don't know where their communities are?
Oh yes. Oh yes, I think lots of people don't know, in part because they may not understand themselves, or they may believe that their sense of self is, if it's not liked by others, they'll say, well, then there must be something wrong with me. Fairly typically, if culture is a problem for a person, they will assume there's something wrong with everybody else. I'm okay, there's something wrong with everybody else. Well, fairly typically when that occurs in any kind of a relationship, it's because there's a cultural difference of some kind, either culture or subculture difference. The real problem with dealing with cultural issues like that is, as I said earlier, culture's so automatic for us. It's unconscious. We don't know we're following the rules of our system until it comes to be a problem. So even being able to bring a problem to the surface is difficult.
Maybe, I think I understand, but can you define culture?
Well, the definition I use of culture is that it is a pattern, in fact, a series of patterns, which permit a person to participate in a group. And you can see those patterns at 4 levels. One level is the level of thinking. So it would include, at that level, the categories of values, attitudes, religious ideals, ethics, metaphysics would all fit at that level of thinking. The second level of speech is important because it's not just what language you speak, but how you define reality. Since we define reality in terms of the vocabulary we have and the way the grammar works in our language. For example, most people who speak a Western European language and who think in a Western European language assume that time exists. When it doesn't, it's a function of the verb system, because verbs in Western languages always have to have tense, and it's impossible to use a verb separate from tense. If you spoke Lakota or Hopi or many native languages in North America, time doesn't exist because the verbs don't work that way. So it's not just a philosophical principle, it's a functional language. So we have thought, speech, actions is the third level of culture. That includes complex action like ceremony, but also everyday purposeful action, such as how do you pass a person on a street? How do you let someone know that you're interested in talking to them? There are all kinds of ways that we do that non-verbally, and each society has a complete system. The fourth level of culture is the easy part. That's the arts, the technology, the physicalness, the clothing, foods, that sort of stuff, the physicalness of the culture. It's at the level of thought that it seems to me understanding is most necessary, but it's also the most difficult. So, patterns of group behavior exemplified in thought, speech, action, artifacts. That's my definition of culture.
And that touches every one of us.
It touches everyone, yeah. Sometimes I come across people who genuinely believe that only other people have culture. I don't have any myself, everybody else has it. But that's simply impossible. Every person has a system of patterns that he or she defines as normative. I understand minority to mean the status of being defined as less by a society. It doesn't necessarily correlate with sex or with race, although in Canadian society and U.S. society it does. It has lifelong effects and may be more powerful in culture. But what I see as the most complicated issue for individuals is the internalization of minority status. Virtually every person who is minority comes to feel that he or she is less, is in fact less, and that idea lurks in the corner all the time. Over a lifetime, you're never going to escape it. It can be overridden, but it has to be but you can only override it with conscious, deliberate effort.
Thank you so much.